The air was thick with the smell of burning cigarette smoke, mingling with the sharp, cold tang of winter in the air. In the small, dimly lit conference room of the Pentagon, men in starched uniforms sat around a heavy oak table, shuffling papers, scanning reports, and murmuring to one another in tones that could only be described as dismissive. They were the men in charge, the ones who had the power to shape the future of the war effort. But they had one thing in common. They couldn't see beyond their own convictions. To them, the war was a machine, one with defined rules, one that ran on fuel and resources, one where women like Dr. Mary Sherman Morgan were an afterthought, a footnote to be ignored. Mary stood at the front of the room, her eyes calm but resolute. She was used to being underestimated, but this time was different. This time, her idea wasn't just a hypothesis. It was a solution that could tip the scales in favor of the Allies. She had spent months working in isolation in the small laboratory tucked away on the outskirts of Washington, where she had synthesized a new chemical compound, a formula that could make aviation fuel more efficient, allowing planes to fly further, to reach enemy territory and return home. In the world of aviation, where every mile counted, this was the key to survival. But no one in that room cared. The men around the table were skeptical at best. They leaned back in their chairs, arms crossed, eyes narrowed, as if they had better things to do than listen to a woman's idea. One of them, a senior officer with graying hair and thick glasses, cleared his throat and spoke first. "Dr. Morgan," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "your formula sounds impressive, but we have a tried-and-true system. You've never flown a bomber. You don't know what it takes to keep them in the air. We need something proven." She took a breath, steadying herself against the tension rising in her chest. She had heard it before. The dismissiveness, the patronizing tone, the constant underestimation of women in the sciences, especially in fields dominated by men. But this time she had something concrete. She wasn't just some idealist or academic. She had done the work. And yet, the room refused to acknowledge her achievements. Mary's mind raced through the facts. This formula could increase fuel efficiency by almost 30%, a staggering figure when it came to military aviation. It wasn't just an improvement, it was a game changer. If her invention was accepted, it could extend the range of Allied bombers, allowing them to strike deeper into enemy territory, with fewer mid-flight refueling stops. It could save countless lives. Yet, as she spoke, her words seemed to fall on deaf ears. They looked at her like she was a curiosity, a novelty, like someone who didn't belong in the room. "Women are not supposed to be chemists in the first place," another officer muttered under his breath. A murmur of agreement spread across the room. "They're supposed to be at home, taking care of their families. What makes you think you can change something this complex?" Her hands tightened around the paper she had brought with her, evidence of her months of meticulous research, her late nights, the hundreds of experiments that had led to this moment. Her eyes flicked to the men around the table, their dismissive expressions unchanging. She could see it in their faces. They were convinced she had no place here. But Mary wasn't going to back down. She was used to fighting for her place in a world that didn't want to recognize her worth. She had spent years working as a chemist, in labs that were hardly more than a glorified broom closet, pushing the boundaries of what was possible in a male-dominated field. She had earned her place at that table. She had earned the right to be heard. "I understand your doubts," she said, her voice steady but strong. "But this isn't theory. This is a solution we need right now. The war is escalating. Fuel is one of our most precious resources. And I've developed a formula that will change the way we approach aviation fuel. Make it more efficient, more effective. It could save lives, save time, and give us the edge we need to defeat the Axis powers. All it needs is your approval." The men looked at each other, exchanging glances that were almost comical in their disinterest. One of them, a younger officer with a sharp jawline and a smirk, shook his head as if she had just told him a fairy tale. "Dr. Morgan," he said with a laugh, "you're asking us to change the way we've always done things, to believe in something that isn't even proven. We can't just gamble with something this important." Mary's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't let her frustration show. She had expected this. The military bureaucracy was slow, cumbersome, and rooted in tradition. Anything new, anything untested, was met with suspicion. But this wasn't just any idea. This was her life's work, and she wasn't about to let it be dismissed. The gamble, gentlemen, she said, her voice firm, is continuing to rely on outdated methods. Every day, we lose aircraft to fuel shortages. Every day, pilots are forced to turn back before completing their missions. If you don't take this seriously, if you don't act now, you're condemning those brave men to die. I've seen the reports. I've read the numbers. We're losing the war in the skies, not because of a lack of skill, but because of a lack of resources. The room was silent. Mary stood her ground, feeling the weight of the moment press down on her. She could feel the stares of the officers, but she refused to look away. There was no time for hesitation. The war was happening now, and she had the solution. She just needed them to see it, to acknowledge it. "Look, Dr. Morgan," the senior officer who had spoken first finally said, his voice dismissive. "This all sounds very impressive, but we don't have time for experiments right now. We need action. We're at war. You'll have to wait." That was the final blow. The men around the table were already moving on to the next item on the agenda, uninterested in the facts she had presented. They were dismissing her invention without a second thought, simply because they didn't want to listen, simply because they couldn't see beyond their own narrow worldview. Mary left the room, the door shutting softly behind her. She felt a surge of anger, but it was quickly replaced by a feeling she had come to know all too well. The quiet fury of being ignored, of being dismissed when you know that you hold the key to something bigger than anyone can see. As she walked down the long, empty hallway of the Pentagon, her mind raced. What now? She knew she couldn't give up. She had come this far, through years of difficult work, through the prejudice and the rejection. But the question still hung heavy in her mind. How could she make them listen? How could she make them see what she had already figured out? It wasn't just about the invention anymore. It was about proving something to herself and to the world, that her voice, her work, mattered. That no matter how many doors were slammed in her face, no matter how many times she was ignored, she would keep pushing, keep fighting, until they had no choice but to see the truth she carried with her. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But if history had taught her anything, it was that the greatest innovations often came from the most unlikely places and the most unlikely people. She wasn't going to let them forget her name. Not now. Not ever. The roar of the engines reverberated through the belly of the bomber, a sound that had long since become a soundtrack of fear, fatigue, and determination. The crew, a mix of young men and seasoned veterans, sat in tense silence. Outside, the endless blue of the Pacific stretched for miles, and in the distance, the faintest outline of enemy territory loomed on the horizon. They were deep into their mission now, a bombing run over a strategic target, vital for the war effort, vital for their survival. But no one was talking about the mission. Not yet. The men aboard the B-17 had one thing on their minds: fuel. They all knew that, unless something changed, this would be their last mission. The fuel gauge had been dropping steadily for the past hour. The fuel tank was dangerously close to empty, and the B-17's engines, strained and groaning under the weight of its heavy payload, were starting to sputter. One wrong move, one wrong calculation, and they wouldn't make it back. There was no turning back now. The target was too far. They couldn't afford to abort. Yet the pilots, the gunners, and the rest of the crew knew the cruel truth. They were running on borrowed time. The B-17, once the pride of American air superiority, was beginning to show its weaknesses. The war had stretched it beyond its limits. They had taken off from a base in the Pacific with barely enough fuel to complete the mission and return to safety. The flight time had been too long, the need for fuel too great. And now, the prospect of having to turn around and head back was as good as a death sentence. The tension was palpable. Every soldier on board knew what was at stake. They all knew that the long hours in the sky, the cold, unrelenting wind slicing through the thin metal of the fuselage, had put them on a razor's edge. They would either make it home or be lost to the ocean below. The cockpit crew began making nervous glances at the instruments. The flight engineer, his face grim, whispered something into the ear of the lead pilot. The pilot nodded and flipped a switch, muttering under his breath, "We're running on fumes, men. I don't know if we'll make it." His words, spoken in the calmest tone he could muster, barely masked the anxiety creeping up on him. The fact was, the fuel was gone before they could even reach their destination. But then, just as the air seemed to tighten with impending doom, something changed. The pilot's eyes flicked to a small, unassuming display. It was a small gauge, once dismissed as irrelevant, now reading a steady increase in fuel efficiency. The new aviation fuel formula, the one Mary Sherman Morgan had devised months ago, was finally in action. In the chaos of war, her work had been overlooked, ignored, and dismissed. But now, in this high-stakes moment, her invention was doing what no one else had thought possible. It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't a sudden burst of hope. It was science. Cold, hard, meticulously tested science. What had once been a forgotten idea, laughed off by the military brass, was now the very thing keeping the B-17 from plunging into the ocean below. Her chemical compound, which made aviation fuel more efficient, was working, even though the military had barely recognized its potential. The result was undeniable. They were flying longer, with less fuel, than they ever had before. But even as the pilot and crew tried to process this unexpected turn of events, the questions kept swirling in the back of their minds. How had this happened? Why had it taken so long for someone to realize the potential of this invention? Why had it been rejected, laughed off, and dismissed by the very people who were supposed to make the decisions that could save lives? The flight continued, and as the B-17 pushed forward into enemy territory, the crew started to realize just how much danger they had been in. They had come close to becoming yet another statistic, another plane lost in the sky, another crew swallowed by the ocean. But now, with every minute that ticked by, the value of Mary Sherman Morgan's invention became clearer. It wasn't just a formula. It was a lifeline. The bomber reached its target and began the bombing run. As the payload dropped from the belly of the aircraft, the men watched through their scopes and cameras, hoping for a direct hit. They had one shot, one chance to make this mission count. But even as they focused on the target below, their thoughts were still with the fuel gauge. How much longer could they stay in the air before the miracle wore off? And yet, even as they executed their mission flawlessly, there was still that haunting knowledge gnawing at the back of their minds. Their survival, their success, had come at a cost. The question hung in the air. Why had Mary's formula not been implemented sooner? If the invention had been adopted earlier, how many lives could have been saved? How many missions could have been carried out without the constant specter of fuel shortages looming overhead? As they finished their mission and began the long journey back, the fuel gauge still reading better than expected, there was a moment of quiet disbelief among the crew. They had made it. They were going home. But it wasn't just the mission success that kept them silent. It was the realization of how close they had come to disaster. They had been sent into the sky with a ticking clock, their chances of survival slimmer than they had ever been before. And yet, they had survived. Thanks to a formula that had been dismissed by so many, they had made it home. But Mary's name still didn't cross their lips. As far as the military was concerned, the formula was just another piece of equipment, another technical breakthrough in the machinery of war. No one gave any thought to the woman who had created it, who had been laughed off by the men in charge and told her ideas didn't matter. No one thought of her when they had gathered around that table, dismissing her invention like an afterthought. The formula had saved them, but she had been lost in the bureaucracy, in the blind spots of institutional indifference. As the B-17 made its way back to the base, the crew members were finally able to breathe easy. Their mission had been a success. They had returned home, but there was still an unanswered question echoing through the aircraft. Why had Mary Sherman Morgan's formula been dismissed for so long? Why had she been ignored, even as the need for innovation had become so painfully clear? In the quiet aftermath of the mission, as the bomber touched down safely on the runway, the men filed out, their minds still racing. Some of them were exhausted, others jubilant, but they all shared one thought. They had just experienced something extraordinary. They had witnessed the power of an idea, the power of an invention that had been overlooked, ignored, and rejected. But the real question was this: how many lives could have been saved if Mary's formula had been recognized earlier? As the crew dispersed and went their separate ways, their victory felt hollow. Yes, they had made a home, but there was no ticker tape parade for the woman who had saved them. No recognition for the chemist who had fought against every odds to provide a solution when no one else had even thought of it. Mary Sherman Morgan's name would remain unspoken in the halls of the Pentagon, forgotten in the chaos of war. But for the men aboard that B-17, her invention had been the difference between life and death. And that, in itself, was a victory that no one could take away. Victory was on the horizon, but the cost of that victory was a burden too heavy to ignore. The war was nearing its end, and the Allied forces were on the offensive, pushing back the Axis powers on all fronts. In the air, the B-17s, B-24s, and P-51 Mustangs had carried the fight to enemy soil, each aircraft pushing the limits of aviation technology. But there was one thing that kept getting overlooked, one truth buried beneath the layers of bureaucracy, politics, and military pride. The aviation fuel formula that had saved so many lives, that had allowed pilots to reach their targets and return home safely, had never received the recognition it deserved. And the woman who had created it, Dr. Mary Sherman Morgan, was still waiting for her moment in the spotlight, her name lost to the shadows. It was a cruel irony. Mary's invention had been the unsung hero of the war effort, quietly saving lives with every mission, every bomber that returned safely to base. But behind the scenes, the recognition for her work was denied. Her formula, which had extended the range of Allied aircraft and reduced the number of missions lost to fuel shortages, was just another tool in the military's arsenal, a tool that would go on to change the course of aviation history, but one that would never be credited to the woman who had created it. In the corridors of power, where the decisions that shaped the fate of nations were made, Mary's name was never spoken. No medals, no awards, no ceremonies in her honor. She had watched as the men who had initially dismissed her invention reaped the rewards of success, their names emblazoned in history books, their contributions acknowledged and celebrated. Yet her role, the one that had made all their victories possible, remained invisible. The system, the very institutions that had been built to protect and promote talent, had failed her. In a world where recognition was often reserved for those with power, privilege, and the right connections, Mary's achievements were erased. But Mary wasn't someone to accept being ignored. She had spent her life fighting against the grain, pushing boundaries in a world that never seemed to want her to succeed. She had been the only woman in many of the rooms where the future of science and technology was being decided. She had worked tirelessly, often in isolation, to prove that a woman's intellect could change the world. And yet, here she was, watching, helpless as her invention was used by thousands, saving lives on a daily basis, without her name ever being associated with it.